You'd be surprised to see an owl caring for a kitten, but that's just how things go here in Vallmere. The day was still cloudy when I first found her. Thimble, a tiny ball of fur, shivering and soaked, tucked away by Maera's enclosure. Somehow she had navigated through the bushes, perhaps seeking warmth or maybe something more mysterious. I had taken in many animals before, but none had looked at me with that kind of trust, as if they were asking for a mother. And I certainly hadn't felt this kind of uncertainty before. I hadn't planned to be home that day. A storm had knocked out the power in the village, prompting me to check on the heat lamps in Maera's space. That's when I noticed her, a little, helpless creature pressed against the aviary fence, her ribs visible through her damp orange fur. For a moment, I feared she was gone. But then, she raised her head, blinked her big round eyes at me, and let out a soft mew. It felt almost like a command. I'm here to stay. Maera remained still on her perch, watching with her characteristic owl stare. Just as I leaned down to pick Thimble up, Maera shifted closer. It wasn't an aggressive move. It felt more like an instinct to protect. In that moment, I knew I should have put some distance between them. Thimble was a stray, and Maera was a bird of prey. It didn't make sense, and it certainly wasn't safe. Yet, I hesitated. Maera hadn't spread her wings or reacted as she typically did when something unexpected entered her territory. Instead, she leaned forward, showing curiosity and calmness. I took Thimble inside, wrapped her in a towel, and started giving her warm fluids. Her little body felt frozen. Despite her weakness, she kept wriggling toward the glass door, as if she sensed Maera was still outside, watching over her. By night, I had settled Thimble into a shoebox next to the radiator, thinking that would be the end of it. But the next morning, the shoebox was empty, and the back door was left unlatched. The house felt eerily quiet that day, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was sharp and unsettling, as if something had changed while I slept. I stood barefoot on the old floorboards, gazing at the empty shoebox while the kettle whistled, its sound breaking through the haze of my thoughts. The towel lay there, slightly wrinkled and still warm, but Thimble was nowhere to be found. I relied more on my instincts than my thoughts as I moved through the cottage, checking every nook and cranny. It wasn't until I stepped out into the soft light of the back garden that I spotted her. Curled up at the base of Maera's enclosure, tucked in just beyond the gate I thought I had locked. Yet there she was, not in danger or frightened, just cozy in the hollow beneath the perch, as if it were the most natural spot for a kitten to nap. Then there was Maera. She was still, impressive in the dim light. She didn't lunge or even stir when I opened the gate and approached. Her large amber eyes remained fixed on mine, but not in the typical way owls look at you, as if you were prey or just a distraction. No, this gaze felt different. It was heavy, intentional. As I crouched down to scoop Thimble into my arms again, Maera tilted her head in that slow, owl-like way, which always seems to convey more than we realize. I didn't feel aggression or even indifference. It was more like acceptance, and something resembling recognition. The changes began subtly, so slight that I questioned my own perceptions. Maera, who used to sit still for hours, started to move along the edges of her enclosure. It wasn't restlessness. It was more like she was aware of something beyond my sight. She didn't hunt her mice with the same skill anymore, often leaving them untouched as Thimble grew more comfortable nestled near her perch. I observed, my instincts clashing with what I knew to be the right course of action, uncertain whether I was witnessing a breakdown of natural boundaries or the emergence of something truly unique. It was Sia, my volunteer, who pointed it out first, the slight limp in Maera's walk, the slight tremble in her left wing. I tried to convince myself it was just the cold, or possibly the signs of aging. But when Jonah stopped by with his mobile kit, he confirmed what I had hesitated to face. The wing we believed to be healed was starting to deteriorate. Scar tissue had thickened and was putting pressure on her nerves. Maera was in pain, and the worst news was that if we didn't perform surgery, there was a risk her entire left wing could lose function. The realization hit me harder than expected. I had always known Maera wouldn't return to the wild, but I had created a dignified life for her here, a space where she ruled as a queen. Surgery would introduce stress, confinement, and possibly even a permanent move to a sanctuary if her condition worsened. As we discussed the options, Thimble nuzzled her tiny head against the curve of Maera's talons, blissfully unaware of just how delicate this moment truly was. I couldn't stop thinking about Maera's eyes. They seemed to ask something beyond what I could grasp. After years of working with animals, I had learned to recognize signs of pain, even when everything appeared calm. But with her, it felt different. She seemed quieter now, moving at a slower pace. Yet, despite her stillness, she never pushed Thimble away. Even when the little kitten nestled against her feathers and purred softly, she stayed close. Still, a sense of worry hung in the air. What if she was struggling beneath that calm surface? Sia, on the other hand, saw a story unfolding. She began sketching them together, Maera, the steadfast guardian, and Thimble, the gentle miracle. To her, this connection felt destined, more than just an act of rescue. So when I brought up the idea of surgery, I noticed her stiffen, her expression darkening with a rare defiance. "You would separate them now?" she said, as if any thought of intervention was a violation of something sacred. Later that evening, Elsie stopped by with herbal salves and questions I wasn't quite prepared for. She spoke of old tales about forest owls adopting orphaned creatures during tough times, a natural way of healing between different species. While I wanted to laugh at the fanciful notion, her whisper, "Maybe she chose her," made me pause. Jonah, always the realist, warned that these kinds of bonds were rare and could easily fall apart. "You're seeing what you want to see, Cal. But it's just an owl, and just a kitten," he said, with a blend of concern and pragmatism. But I found myself questioning if that was entirely true. Word began to spread through Vallmere. At first, it was just whispers in the bakery line and knowing glances at the co-op. Before long, a few curious townsfolk showed up to catch a glimpse of the unlikely duo. They gathered outside the fence, their eyes wide with wonder, snapping photos as if to capture a moment that demanded respect and quiet admiration. Yet each step they took felt like a crack forming in the fragile world I had tried to maintain. Then Ronan Bell from Animal Control arrived, clipboard in hand and a firm handshake. He recited policy as if it were a great truth. While his concern was sincere, it carried an air of coldness. "Cross-species bonding is unstable, Callum. You can't monitor them forever. The owl is wild, the kitten isn't. That creates a liability," he stated plainly. He left a notice on my shed door, stating that my license review was now pending. It felt urgent, like a door slowly closing. At the same time, I couldn't ignore Maera's decline any longer. She had stopped eating altogether. While her gaze stayed steady when Thimble nestled against her, it was clear her strength was fading. Thimble, unaware of the gravity of the situation, started to imitate Maera, climbing onto the lower branches of her perch, blinking slowly, and tilting her head as if she belonged there. That evening, I stood at the edge of the enclosure, feeling torn between what seemed like love and the harsh reality of inevitability. I questioned whether I had the authority to choose which emotion mattered more. I found myself watching them more often than I focused on my work. No longer as a caretaker, but as someone grappling with an unanswered question. My instincts, shaped by years of rescue work, told me I should intervene. Keep Thimble inside, prepare Maera for relocation, protect them in any way I could before it all fell apart. Yet each time I opened that gate, Maera would move just enough to signal that she still recognized me, not as a threat or even as her keeper, but as something separate from their bond. And Thimble, she had stopped vocalizing altogether. She didn't meow for food or for me. Only once when I tried to take her indoors did she push back, her claws digging gently into the soft earth under Maera's perch. It wasn't a violent struggle, but it held a quiet desperation that nearly broke me. I realized I was nearing a decision point. Maera needed surgery, and time was running out. But taking her meant taking Thimble too. Splitting them apart could unravel whatever strength Maera had left. Yet keeping them together felt like accepting an unknown that I couldn't fully grasp or control, and possibly couldn't protect against. That night, I stood by the door, lights off, just listening. And through the rustling wind, I heard it. A soft, steady purr, blending with the rhythm of fluttering feathers. The first feathers appeared at the edge of the woods, small with white tips scattered in a half-moon shape near the ravine where the foxes roam. I knew they weren't from Maera. She never ventured outside her enclosure. Yet something about them weighed heavily on my heart. Then I noticed the second sign. Scratch marks on the aviary fence, low yet deep, clearly fresh. This wasn't just the idle curiosity of a raccoon. It felt like something was testing the boundaries, searching for a way in. That same night, I decided to set up the trail camera. The morning light brought a sense of unease. I spotted a young badger, alone and curious, circling the enclosure at dusk, standing on its hind legs and pawing at the mesh. Inside, Thimble had been with Maera the whole time. At first, I didn't share this with Sia. I wanted to protect her from heartbreak, or from feeling driven to act in haste. But she eventually discovered the footage on my laptop. She sat there, watching in silence for several minutes before asking softly, "They're not safe here anymore, are they?" I didn't have an answer for her. Later that evening, the vet called to confirm Maera's surgery date, just 4 days away. Ronan left me another message that was less friendly than usual. "You're creating a risky situation," he warned. "If anything goes wrong, it's your responsibility, Callum." That night, I stayed in the enclosure with them. Sleep eluded me as I watched. Maera's eyes blinked slowly under the moonlight, while Thimble nestled beneath her wing, trusting and delicate. It struck me then, I was the only one unsure of what to do next. I decided to leave the enclosure gate unlatched at night. This wasn't an act of carelessness, it was a conscious choice. I had begun to doubt that I was the one keeping Maera and Thimble safe. Instead, it seemed like they were supporting each other. Maera had stopped eating unless Thimble was close by. The little kitten would nudge a quail egg with her face or bat at it until Maera finally took notice, responding with a soft nip, as if she was only doing it to please the kitten. Sia started visiting every afternoon. She no longer chattered like before, but moved through the garden with intention and respect. She brought sketchbooks filled with stunning drawings that took my breath away, illustrations of Thimble acting as a guardian beneath Maera's broad chest, the owl gazing at stars with eyes that reflected sorrow. One evening, Sia said gently, "She's fading, but she isn't afraid. Maybe it's because she knows she won't be alone." Elsie returned unexpectedly, sharing a tale from the Highlands about an owl and a fox cub, both orphaned, who survived a blizzard together. "Sometimes the forest acts in mysterious ways when it wants something to survive," she said, "even if the world around them doesn't comprehend it." And Jonah? He became softer too. After observing Maera and Thimble together, he wondered aloud, "Do you think maybe this connection is what's keeping her alive?" I didn't respond. There was no need to. That night, as the wind picked up and a coat of frost settled on the ground, I tucked Thimble's blanket closer to Maera's perch. For the first time, Maera reached down, not with her beak, but with one of her broad, feathered wings. She pulled the kitten underneath, offering warmth and shelter in an unexpected moment of kindness. 3 days before the surgery was scheduled, Ronan returned. This time, he wasn't there to issue warnings. Instead, he brought paperwork. The shelter board had reviewed the situation and informed me that I needed to relocate Maera to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center by week's end. If I didn't comply, my license would be at risk. They focused on public safety, emotional disturbance, and animal welfare policies. Hearing this, I remained silent, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. It wasn't just the message that unsettled me, it was the lack of understanding of the bond forming between those two creatures. After Ronan left, I walked to the enclosure, still clutching the notice. Maera stood exactly as she always did, her head low and feathers slightly puffed up. Remarkably, Thimble had started to imitate her movements, stretching like Maera, tilting her head slowly and blinking in sync. I found myself watching them longer than intended, grappling with the dilemma of what I could control in this situation. That evening, I reached out to Jonah, asking if there was any possibility of performing the surgery on site. He paused before responding, saying, "It's risky, but I'll discuss it with the board." Sia was upset when I shared the relocation order with her. She sat on the porch for hours, wrapping her arms around her knees in silence. Eventually, she spoke softly but firmly, "If you send them away, they'll break." I wanted to explain that I felt trapped without options. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the entire truth. I did have choices. I just wasn't sure I could accept either outcome. The night before I had to make my final decision, the house felt quieter than usual, as if the walls were absorbing the tension. I sat at the kitchen table with Jonah, blueprints for a makeshift surgical space spread between us. He said we could attempt the procedure here, but it would be a tight squeeze. The risks were significant: anesthesia in an unsterile setting, a lack of backup staff, and the potential for serious consequences if anything went wrong. If she wakes up confused or scared, he warned, she might lash out, and the kitten... I interrupted him. I already understood the implications all too well. If Maera forgot Thimble or turned against her, it would lead to a dire conclusion, marked not by fantasy, but by harsh reality and sadness. Sia stood firmly at the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression resolute. I'll stay with her during the surgery. I'll hold Thimble and talk to Maera. She recognizes me now. Jonah began to object, but I raised a hand to quiet him. It was clear from Sia's demeanor that her mind was made up. After Jonah left, I stepped outside one last time before dawn would force us into action. Maera rested on her perch, her feathers ruffled and her breath steady. Below her, Thimble napped, snuggled against her shadow. As I approached, Maera met my gaze, not with fear but with a gentler energy. It felt like permission, possibly even trust. So I leaned in and whispered, "Tomorrow we will try, only if you're ready." She remained still, but in the soft breeze, I thought I could hear her sigh, deep and calm, as if she understood the choice we were making. As dawn broke, the forest was enveloped in a delicate silver mist, every branch and leaf seeming to pause. Inside the makeshift surgical tent we set up in the barn, an atmosphere of anxiety surrounded us. Jonah moved methodically, checking the monitors and getting the anesthesia ready. Sia sat quietly on a stool near the wall, thus holding Thimble close, who vibrated with a nervous purr. Although we decided Thimble shouldn't be near the surgery table, she insisted on staying. "She needs to hear us," Sia said, her voice trembling with unspoken emotions. Maera lay calm, perhaps too calm. I was able to lift her without resistance. Her weight felt different than it had just weeks before. I settled her down gently, murmuring as Jonah placed the mask over her beak. Maera blinked slowly, as if taking in her surroundings. And then the surgery began. For 47 minutes, my focus narrowed to the sounds around us. The rustle of gloves, the hissing of breaths through masks, and the quiet beeping of a heart monitor suited for creatures much larger. I watched Maera's chest, hoping for movement, fearing any indication that things might not go as planned. Outside, the wind stirred, shaking the barn's old wooden frame. Sia leaned close to Thimble, softly repeating, "She's coming back, she's coming back, she's coming back." But then, at the 34-minute mark, Maera's breathing ceased. Just like that, she stopped. Jonah's voice cut through the stillness. "Callum." They acted quickly. They injected, stimulated, and cleared her airway. While seconds seemed to stretch, everything around them blurred. Then, all at once, her chest began to rise again, shallow but unmistakable. It wasn't safety they felt, not yet, but it wasn't the end either. Callum knelt in the dim light of the barn, his breath hitching as he drew back his trembling hands from Maera, who lay under a wrinkled blanket on the table. Just moments before, her heart had faltered. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Scottish Highlands. Soft rays of sunlight filtered through the open door, lighting up the speckled feathers of Maera in golden hues. In the stillness, even the wind seemed to pause. Thimble, the tiny kitten, crept forward with wide, glistening eyes, pressing against her side with a hopeful meow. Sia rested on her heels, holding a blood-stained swab while tears filled her eyes. She watched with a mix of fear and hope, silently willing the owl to breathe. Callum felt a tightness in his throat as he leaned closer, resting a trembling hand on Thimble's back while the kitten nestled into Maera's soft chest. For a heartbeat, silence enveloped them. All was still. Then suddenly, a twitch. Maera's talons curled slightly, and the monitor beeped, revealing a fragile rhythm returning. Callum let out a shocked laugh that turned into a sob. Maera's eyelids flickered open, showing a glint of amber. A weak, questioning hoot escaped her, not much more than a whisper. Thimble responded with a comforting purr, snuggling under Maera's outstretched wing. Gathering her strength, Maera gently shifted her great wing, cradling the trembling kitten against her. Sia let out a long breath, breaking into a shaky smile as she placed a hand over her heart. Callum bowed his head, tears spilling as relief and wonder washed over him. In that quiet moment, dust motes danced in the early light, binding these unlikely companions closer together. Maera was alive, though fragile, and Thimble looked up at her as if a dream had come true. The future remained uncertain, but for now, hope felt warm and reassuring. In the gentle rhythm of Maera's breaths, Thimble found a motherly comfort. In the days that followed, the house transformed. It wasn't louder, not exactly, but the air felt different, softer, as though something intangible had settled into the walls. Maera remained weak, often resting with her head tucked beneath her wing, yet she was beginning to eat again, albeit slowly. Thimble never left her side, curling up in the folds of Maera's feathers. The kitten's small body rose and fell with the owl's shallow breaths, mirroring the tide against the shore. I had never witnessed a bond quite like this one, not during my years working with wildlife, nor through all the little wonders that nature has revealed to me. Every afternoon after school, Sia would come by. She continued to sketch, but her drawings had shifted. They were no longer whimsical tales. They had transformed into raw portrayals of exhaustion, hope, and the unique, gentle love reflected in Maera's weary eyes, alongside Thimble's unwavering loyalty. Jonah visited less frequently, but when he did, he would spend more time near the enclosure, silently observing without a word. We couldn't know how much longer Maera had, could be months, or perhaps even less. Regardless of the time allowed, she spent it fully. Wings softly opened, a kitten nestled close, with no barriers between them. Sometimes I think about whether we witnessed something out of the ordinary, or if we simply caught sight of nature at its most remarkable. What if Maera wasn't destined to be a mother, but chose to be one instead? Thimble, in her delicate resilience, had bravely asked for that bond. If this story resonated with you, even slightly, take a moment to reflect on it. Consider how love can appear in unexpected ways, in the soft rustle of feathers, in a gentle sound from the edge of a cage, or in choices driven by a deeper connection, rather than logic. We might never fully grasp the relationship between Thimble and Maera, but perhaps that uncertainty is part of its beauty. Sometimes, knowing that it existed is enough. If you believe that connections can transcend boundaries, that healing can take on unusual forms, and that trust can flourish even between predator and prey, then you share in this narrative. We will continue to document these moments, these unexpected rescues and soft miracles. If you want to follow along, consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What might you have done in Callum's situation? And if you know someone who could use a sprinkle of hope, think about sharing this story with them. Often, all it takes is the courage to ask and the openness to respond.